Okay, today I'm going to show you how to fit up a guard for a hidden tang or a pierced guard style of knife. This is my personal hunting knife. I've carried it for the last 2 years. It's got a hidden tang with a brass guard on it. And so here we have 52-100 Hunter. It's got almost a 4-inch blade. It is set up for a hidden tang. I'm going to show you how to go from this and a piece of bar stock to a fit up slot inside the bar stock that this goes inside of. It's just going to be the fit up. I can show you later how to shape the outside of the guard, how to do the glue up. I use JB Weld. And how to do the final finishing of the guard during the handle assembly. But I like to use brass most of the time. Personally, I like brass the best. It's also the easiest to work. So anyway, to start off with, you have to make sure that your blade is set up for the guard correctly. If it is set up, it makes guard fitting a breeze. If it's not set up correctly, you'll fight it, and still not get a good fit. So what you're looking at to start with is you're looking for this measurement right here. You want to take that and then make sure it's a nice smooth taper all the way to the end. And then the taper from where the guard will sit on the thickness of the blade, and make sure that is a smooth taper all the way to the end. That's really important. If you have that set up, like I said, it'll go smooth, and if you don't, you will fight it. Also, before you fit the guard up, make sure that you have your base finish. This is a dirty 1000 grit hand sanded finish, and the base edge has been made. I went ahead and sharpened this and tested it out on some rope, did some edge flex testing with it, and everything looks good. The reason for that is that a lot of times you'll start sharpening the blade on the belt grinder just to remove just to kind of set the edge up. If you do that after the guard and the handle's already installed, and you're a little heavy-handed, or you spend just a little bit too much time on here, you'll end up with an undergrind right here. With no guard and blade, that's easy to fix. You just grind your ricasso back a little bit to match. With the guard and handle installed, that's really tough to get that matched back up. So get your base edge on first. You can dull it up later, but anyway, so just make it so that the only thing that's going to touch that edge after you're done is a sharpening stone, because you won't remove very much material by hand like that. Anyway, so I went ahead and fast forwarded a little bit. You'll need your guard material, the blade, a clamp, and a pencil. You will set your blade on your guard material approximately like that. Clamp it in place. Draw your outline of that junction. Take that off, and then drill yourselves 2 holes. They're slightly undersized from the blade thickness. I moved that one a little bit farther back in the drawing than what I should have, so I moved that one a little bit farther to match it and keep that spacing correct. This blade is 153 thousandths thick, so I used a 140 thousandths thick drill bit just to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. Once you have your holes drilled, go ahead and clamp it up in a vise. Then you can take a square needle file and then just square up the bottoms of that hole. That gives you a nice flat spot for your jeweler's saw to begin cutting. Grab a jeweler's saw. I use, I believe these are size size 14 blades. And jeweler's saw, you'll have one side open. Insert that. Put the handle up against your chest. Put the blade in the jaws. Pull tight against your chest. Tighten it down, and that puts the blade under tension so that it cuts easiest. I set these up to cut on the pull stroke because jeweler's saw blades are they're very thin. They break really easy, and by setting them up on the pull stroke, they cut quite a bit faster. Now while I'm cutting this out, I forgot to set my timer. I call these my 15-minute guards because it generally takes me 15 minutes or so to make a guard. That's normal. I mean, I can have a misstep or two in there, and still it usually takes me around 15 minutes or so. It used to take me several hours just to fit a guard up when I first started out. I'd sit there and I'd spend 3-4 hours on a guard with needle files, get the fit just about where I wanted to, and then mess it up from then on, and then I'd have to start all over again. Well, after you make a couple of hundred of these, you start getting your processes and your times down considerably. You start getting better with the tools and everything also. But this way is the fastest and easiest way that I know of to make a guard on, say, a hunter or an everyday carry type of knife. I do have a lathe with a milling attachment. And I know a lot of guys mill their guard slots. I do mill my guard slots when I'm making like bolsters on a chef's knife. And the reason I do those with the lathe and the milling attachment is because when I make kitchen knives, I make them with very thin stock, usually 3/32, which is about 0.94 or so on your starting stock. And that's awful dang thin to be getting your files in and out of to be able to cut that slot open. So I have an end mill on the lathe to do those. Everything else I do by hand, just like this. Mostly because this is the way I'm used to doing it. And it doesn't take very long to do it this way anyway. So anyhow, now we have a slot. You can tell that I stayed in between the lines. And now we need to square it up. Use a nice thin 4-inch flat file. One side's been ground off, not so much to make it a safe file, but to make it thinner so that it'll go into the slot a little bit easier. I like using the widest file that I can possibly get into the guard slot. And what I mean by that is, okay, your tang is that wide. Use the widest file that you can get in there. If you try using, say, a flat needle file, okay, well that file's only going to cut its width. So you'd have to cut here, cut here, cut here, and cut here, and then blend all of those cuts all together to make a straight side. But if you get the widest file that you can get in there, now with this file I only have to cut here and then blend in up here. But this file, I'm just going to use it to open things up and square it up so that I can get my wider files in there. And that way with each and every stroke I'm cutting a nice straight line with the file. So here, just removing that, straightening things up, because the jeweler saw has got such a skinny blade that I'm not so good at cutting a straight line with it. So I'm just kind of opening things up a little bit to where I can get my bigger file in there. Now, I'm going to cut this slot a little bit differently because of the what I'm going to attach the guard to the blade with. You can attach the guard to the blade. The two most popular materials that I know of is solder or JB weld. Solder is a little bit stronger than JB weld, but if you try to set your guard up to use solder and use JB weld instead of solder, you'll have a horrible experience with it. Vice versa, if you try to set up your guard to use JB weld and you use solder instead, it's not going to turn out right. Because solder is very thin. It'll go into the smallest of gaps and seal things up. And that's all we're doing here, is making a we want to get this thing to where it's a press fit. So either the solder or the JB weld, it has nothing to do with the strength of the joint. All we're after with that is a moisture seal. And JB weld works really good for that. Anyway, so now that I have my slot mostly squared up, it sure looks to me like it's going to be about the right height and the right width. So we've got our base slot cut. Up to now, you can move as fast as you want to move, because if you mess it up, first of all, you don't have very much time into it, so you can start over again real easy. And second of all, you're removing large amounts of material. The closer and closer you get to the finished guard, the slower and slower you want to move. Like I said, when I first started doing this, it took me hours and hours and hours to do one guard. And most of that was trying to figure out when to move fast and when to move slow. So now I'm just going to go ahead and come back in with a little bit newer file and file just until the corners or the edges of the holes are gone, because the drill bit cuts a round hole and we need a square slot. Okay, so most of I've got a little bit more on the top to go. Now this blade also, when I measured it, it was 153 thousandths thick at the ricasso on the spine and 157 thousandths thick at the edge side of our guard resting area. So I want to keep that in mind, that the edge side needs to be 4 thousandths wider of a slot than the spine side. Now here's what we're going to start doing now. Okay, so we took our guard material, we drilled 2 holes, we cut that material out. At the end, we're going to put little corners on here to fit where the shoulders of the blade is going to sit. Here is what we have now. We have straight sides all the way through. Now this is a spine view, so the spine would be here, the edge would be here, the sides of the knife. Okay, what we want to get to is here, because we're using JB weld, and JB weld isn't thin enough to go inside a press fit in between the blade and the guard material. So what we're going to do is we're going to file that slot like this, to where it's wider at the back and wider at the back and narrower at the front. Then we're going to come back in and we're going to cut we're going to cut these flats on right here. So that way we'll have this. Now this is obviously larger than what it needs to be, but that way we'll have this, we'll have an area for the JB weld to fill in and to be able to hold. So what we're going to do is come in here, and instead of keeping our file straight at 90 degrees to the face of the guard, we're going to put it on an angle. And we're going to file in that triangle in the back. If you were using solder, you wouldn't want to do this. You'd want to keep that slot straight through there because the solder is thinner and it will flow in between a very tight gap in between your blade and guard material. The reason I like using JB Weld most of the time is because, like I said, this is just a moisture seal that the JB Weld or the solder is going to be accomplishing. Since we're a press fit in between the blade and the guard, we don't really need a whole lot of strength. We just need the moisture seal. And solder, you have to use flux. And a lot of times flux, it's acid based, and so you might not get all the acid out of the joint, and later on down the road that acid will eat its way out of that joint. So that was a fresher file. Now I'm going to go to a duller file because now I want to start moving slow. So what I want to do now is keep my file 90 degrees to the face of the guard, or thereabouts, and just cut in a couple of flats. Cut in a couple of flats on both sides of it. Now we're ready for our first drive-on fit. So we'll put a piece of leather around the blade to protect it. Tighten it down. And then we're going to use what everybody calls a squashed pipe tool. So you take a round pipe, this one's copper, and put a little bit of squash in it so it's no longer round. And you can see I've used this one a few times. It's all squashed down, but it's 3/4 inch copper pipe, so that doesn't bother me too much. When it gets too short, I'll just make another one. We'll center this up in here. Start driving it on. Now, one nice thing about brass is that since it's so malleable, meaning kind of soft, it'll kind of move around that blade. Okay, so we're looking good here. We've got a nice tight fit on both sides. We've still got a little bit of a gap. We've got a little bit of a gap there, a little bit of a gap there, and we've got a nice gap around all four sides for the JB weld to go into for our moisture seal. I'm doing this left-handed. This is the second video that I've made like this, because you want to stay off to the side when you're pounding this off. Reason for that is if you pound it, that blade's going right in the direction of my chest, and I don't want that knife in my chest. That's why this blade has got the brass smears on it already. The first video I made, I had the camera over here to my left, and the camera was sitting right about where my left shoulder normally sits so that you could see everything, but it threw me off, and I ended up cutting the slot in crooked, as in when the knife was in the slot, instead of it being straight up and down, it was off to the side like that. But anyways, so now that we got that out, we can look at both the brass smears on the tang to see where we're hitting, and we can also see any shiny spots inside that brass, because your file will leave one finish, and then forcing that tang in there will smooth the file marks off. So any place that looks shiny, that's where we're making contact at. And I know we were pretty close just from the depth that we made it on the blade. So I'll take my duller file again and come back in and just take a couple of small strokes off each side. And then we'll try it again. So what we're going to do here is we're fitting the guard up to the flats. Okay, so we fit the guard up to the flats, both sides of the sides of the tang. Once we get to that point, we've got a really nice fit here. I mean, I haven't gone back over and sanded the face of the guard yet, but it's going to be really nice. Now that we have the sides fit up, now we've got to cut the brass to match the shoulders right there. And we've still got a good gap all the way around for our JB weld. So you can take a pencil and just for a reference, okay, I'm going to mark this and then show you where I marked it. Okay, so I ran my pencil down here and I marked the brass where the blade's going to end. That just gives me a reference as to how far to file. Each time you take the knife and put it in and out of the guard also, it'll stretch the brass a little bit. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're fitting. Okay, so now I've got a pretty coarse square file. It does not have any safe sides, but if it'll fit in there, all I'm doing is trying to hog some of that material out. So at this point, as long as you keep the file inside there, you can move fast, because you're just hogging the material out and you're not doing any real fitting. You're just getting it ready to fit. Now I want to stay inside my pencil mark because the width of that pencil mark, plus it was not able to get directly up against the blade. Okay, now right about here I like to use my reading glasses just to get me a little bit closer. Now we're going to go up just almost to this line right here. Okay, that side's done. Double check where my pencil mark is. Go back up in there and move that line a little bit closer to the rest of it. Not all the way to it, just closer. So now we have our shoulders roughed in. Now we'll center this up and then drive it on. Okay, now we got pretty close, but there's still a gap. Might not even be able to see it. You can see how the brass has been pushed up by the fitting, so I'll have to take the face of that off here in a second. But I've got a little bit of a gap right there, and then the front side looks pretty good. So I'm down to a minute and a half left on this tape. I'm going to go ahead and shut it off, take the blade back out, and then I can show you the little burrs in there and why you don't go all the way to the center lines when you're cutting those or to the side lines when you're cutting those corners in, at least at that point.